My name's Michael Spinar, and I'm the Lake Michigan Lakewide Action and Management Plan, or LAMP program coordinator for the state of Indiana. On behalf of the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first in a series of free webinars on topics anticipated to be of interest to the watershed protection and restoration community. Just so that everyone is aware, this session is being recorded. When the time comes for today's question and answer session, you will be able to unmute yourself. If you would prefer, however, there is a chat window at the bottom of your screen in which you may type your questions instead. This webinar series is anticipated to run from now through February to coincide with the development of the 2020 to 2024 Lake Michigan LAMP, which is the first for this particular Great Lake to be developed under the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the United States and Canada. Once released, the LAMP will report out on the state of Lake Michigan and its ecosystem with respect to 9 high-level general objectives of that agreement. But more than that, it'll document the action priorities to be undertaken by the approximately 16 federal, tribal, state, and local agencies and organizations comprising the Lake Michigan Lake Partnership to assess, protect, and restore the lake during that 5-year time period. When the draft LAMP is complete, members of the public will be provided with an opportunity to comment on the draft document. So the primary goals of this webinar series are to provide education about tools and programs available to watershed groups and others to assist with implementation of watershed protection and restoration efforts, to improve communication and information sharing among watershed groups in Indiana's portion of the Lake Michigan Basin, and finally, to better connect groups operating in the western portion of the basin, which we refer to as the coastal region, with the eastern portion, which we generally refer to as the St. Joseph River Basin. As such, these presentations are targeted toward a broad audience, which includes watershed groups, MS4 coordinators, environmental organizations, land trusts, and members of the public with an interest in watershed protection and restoration. Although the webinars will have a Lake Michigan focus, many of the webinars will be of interest to a broader statewide group. Each of the webinars will be scheduled for approximately 60 minutes from 1 to 2 p.m. Central Time or 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, unless otherwise noted. Please refer to the Lake Michigan Webinar Series webpage, which is located at in.gov/IDEM/Lake Michigan/2679.htm for the latest scheduling updates and recordings of past presentations. And we will be flashing that web address at the conclusion of today's presentation. It's my pleasure today to introduce Mr. Sam Ennett from IDEM's Office of Water Quality, who is our first speaker. So, our guinea pig today. Sam is the Central Region Watershed Non-Point Source Specialist for IDEM and will be providing an overview of watersheds and how IDEM supports local watershed management efforts to meet the goals of the Clean Water Act.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam Ennett. I work with IDEM's Watershed Planning and Restoration section, which houses the non-point source and TMDL programs at IDEM. Today, I'm here to talk to you about how IDEM implements the Clean Water Act and how the non-point source program supports local watershed management. So the first question we might ask ourselves is, what is a watershed? A watershed is an area of land where all water flows to a single point. Imagine a raindrop falls within the area marked by black arrows. Eventually, that drop will flow to the common discharge point at the mouth of the river. If a raindrop fell in the areas marked by blue arrows, it would end up in a different river basin. Watersheds are the basic building block of IDEM's restoration process because the quality of water leaving the watershed is a reflection of the ecosystems, land uses, and activities that occur within the watershed. The next question many people will have is, what is the difference between point and non-point source pollution? The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, defines point source pollution as any single identifiable source of pollution from which pollutants are discharged, such as a pipe, ditch, ship, or factory smokestack. In the graphic on the screen, you can see pipes discharging from the factory and the sewage treatment plant, which are two common types of point sources. Generally, point sources are regulated through a permitting process like the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Non-point source pollution does not have a defined discharge point and instead comes from rainwater passing over diffuse sources in the landscape and includes things like excess fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, and animal and human feces from agricultural lands and residential areas. It can also include oil, grease, and toxic chemicals from urban runoff and energy production, sediment from improperly managed construction sites, crops and forest lands, and eroding stream banks. In the image, we can see a parking lot next to the river where rain could potentially wash oil drippings from the car into the river. Generally, there is very little regulation of non-point sources of pollution, and a voluntary approach is taken to mitigate them. IDEM has many programs to support water quality improvements, but the Planning and Restoration section, which implements the non-point source program, works primarily through local watershed groups. One of the ways we support these groups is through watershed specialists, a couple of whom are here today with me. Amanda Studerbond is the Northwest Region Specialist, which includes the Lake Michigan Coastal Zone, and Christy Todd is the Northeast Region Specialist and serves the St. Joseph watershed that drains to Lake Michigan. I am the non-point source pollution specialist and helps coordinate regional efforts. The watershed specialists provide a wide range of services and support that will be covered throughout this presentation. Every state that develops a non-point source or NPS program must have a state non-point source plan to guide their work. The goals and objectives of this plan drive the use of federal funding at the state level. There are specific guidelines from the US EPA on what must be included in a state non-point source plan. Indiana's most recent plan revision occurred in 2019 and can be found on the non-point source webpage, or the link on the screen. The NPS plan sets the priorities for 319 funding, including the development and implementation of watershed management plans. The NPS plan also highlights the need for cooperation and partnership to make progress on statewide issues like nutrients, sediment maintenance, or septic maintenance, hydro modification, and drinking water protection. Now let's dig into some of the details of the Clean Water Act. The goal of the Clean Water Act is, well, clean water. And how clean the water is can be determined by meeting what are called water quality standards. Standards include designated uses, which are what we intend to use the water for, and criteria that are used to determine whether the water meets the designated use. With a few well-defined exceptions, all of Indiana's waters are designated for full body contact recreation, like swimming, and warm water aquatic life use. Some waters have other designated uses as well, like public drinking water as an example. Water quality standards are set at the state level and can be found in Indiana's administrative code. I've included the link so that you can look them up if you would like. Section 2.1 covers most of the state, and Section 2.1.5 covers the Great Lakes watershed specifically. They are generally similar, but some Great Lakes standards are stricter. The EPA also identifies two general types of criteria, narrative and numeric. Narrative criteria are often called the free-froms. Like all surface waters at all times and at all places shall meet the minimum conditions of being free from substances, materials, floating debris, oil, or scum. You get the idea. Numeric water quality criteria provide a threshold above or below which a substance is violating water quality standards. Some parameters that Indiana has water quality criteria for include dissolved oxygen, pH, E. coli, toxics and metals, temperature, ammonia, chloride, and sulfate. Indiana also has public water supply standards for those surface waters that are a source of drinking water. Several important non-point source parameters such as nutrients and sediment are not included on this list. IDEM is responsible for determining the status of Indiana's water and progress toward meeting the goals of the Clean Water Act. For the next several slides, we will go over each portion of this graphic in greater detail, which just kind of shows you the basic loop of what the process is for working on the clean water. The first task that we go through is assessment, which is the process of conducting water monitoring around the state and comparing the results to the water quality standards we talked about previously. The photo in this graphic shows an IDEM crew electrofishing to sample fish community, which is an important assessment process. IDEM monitors many parameters to determine whether we are meeting the state's designated uses. General chemistry refers to parameters such as ammonia, dissolved oxygen, and temperature. IDEM also tests for metals such as aluminum and copper. Nutrients include nitrogen and phosphorus, also including dissolved reactive phosphorus, which is what we think is driving the algal blooms in Western Lake Erie. We also monitor E. coli as a surrogate for waste in the water, and ambient conditions include flow, air temperature, and precipitation. Organics comprise pesticides and petroleum compounds such as fuel oil. And finally, we characterize the macroinvertebrate and fish communities and their available habitats. IDEM has two primary aquatic monitoring programs, probabilistic and targeted. Probabilistic monitoring follows a statistical design, including randomly identified stream sites at various stream order levels that allow us to extrapolate conditions across the state. This allows us to make statements such as X% of Indiana's waters are meeting our aquatic life designated use. We perform probabilistic monitoring on rivers, streams, and lakes. The second type of monitoring is targeted monitoring. These sample designs vary based upon the objective of the individual program. Some of these sampling programs, like fixation and watershed characterization, take place year-round, while others are only during certain periods like the recreation season. Lastly, IDEM's efforts of the Hoosier River Watch Citizen Monitoring Program, but does not officially take part in the program. So when we compare monitoring results to water quality standards, there are two possible outcomes. A water can meet standards, which is what we hope for, or it may not meet them. When a water does not meet a water quality standard, it is classified as impaired. The Clean Water Act says that all waters that don't meet water quality standards should be placed on a list of impaired waters known as the 303D list. 303D sounds complicated, but it just refers to the section of the Clean Water Act that describes this step in the process. This list is available on the web, either as a spreadsheet or as a map, which I'll show you next. In my opinion, the easiest way to see the state's impaired waters is through IDEM's online E303D mapping application shown here on the screen. This is an online tool that allows users to browse the state waterways via map and see their condition. If you zoom in on the map I just showed you, the waterways will appear. The streams shown in red on this map have been assessed and determined to be impaired and are published on the list. Other categories can also be shown, including those that meet standards and those that have not been assessed, and those are referred to on the categories in the categories on the left on the legend. The designations for each category are a little bit dense, so I'll skip that for now, but if you are interested in learning more, there is a tutorial that can be found online. So after all of that, how can watershed specialists help local watershed groups with impaired waterways? So the first thing that we can help you with is interpreting water quality standards or other applicable water targets. We can help determining whether waters are impaired or if they have even been assessed. We can help obtaining current and previous 303D lists. So 303D lists are published every 2 years. And so there's multiple iterations of the list. And we can also help obtain the REACH index for Indiana streams and lakes. REACH indexes are state-defined stream and lake segments used to refer to very specific regions of streams and lakes for water quality purposes. And watershed specialists can also help with mapping applications. So for most impaired waterways on the 303D list, although not all, the next step is to develop a total maximum daily load, or TMDL. But first, what exactly is a total maximum daily load? A TMDL is simply a calculation that tells us the amount of pollutant a water body can receive and still meet all water quality standards. We calculate these loads by identifying the pollutant, determining the current levels of the pollutant through monitoring in the streams, and then finally creating a report that puts it all together. Most importantly, a TMDL report is a tool that can be used by the agency to update permits as required for stakeholders like you, watershed groups, local agencies, universities, etc., to positively affect water quality. The TMDL document by itself is not going to fix the problems, but it does contain a lot of valuable information and is a great tool to help guide watershed planning. So what does a TMDL provide? TMDLs contain a description of the watershed and the water quality data on the impairment. They also contain an overview of the potential sources of the pollutant, both point and non-point source. A TMDL shows the amount of a pollutant of concern that a water body can receive and still meet water quality standards or targets that apply to the watershed. And the TMDLs contain a list of pollutant load reductions necessary to meet the water quality standards or targets that apply to the watershed. A TMDL calculation follows these basic steps. Monitoring and assessment determines the existing load. Then TMDL staff determine the total maximum daily load for each pollutant based off of the water quality standards and create what are called the load allocation and waste load allocation. Basically, they are calculating how much of each pollutant the water body can have and still meet the water quality standards. Lastly, the sources of pollution are assigned to the load allocations and a specific reduction is calculated if necessary. IDEM has a process to pick watersheds for prioritization process to pick watersheds for new TMDLs. IDEM works with a local sponsor to support the writing of a TMDL. IDEM is updating the TMDL template to improve the transition from TMDL to water implementation to provide reasonable assurance that the TMDLs can be met. IDEM is consistently working to improve the TMDL process, and we are looking to work with active sponsors to improve the transition. Sorry. Watershed specialists can also help groups with questions about TMDLs. We can help locate TMDLs, help a group request a TMDL for their watershed if it doesn't already exist, and we can help interpret existing TMDLs. Another great resource is Caleb Renneker, who is our senior TMDL project manager. Once a TMDL is developed, local groups can apply for funding from the 319 non-point source program to create a watershed management plan and implement the TMDL. This is, of course, one of our most popular roles. IDEM provides about $2 million worth of funding per year to support watershed management throughout the state. Non-point source funds, also known as 319 funds from the section of the Clean Water Act that supports them, may be used to conduct water quality assessments, develop and implement TMDL or watershed management plans, provide for technical assistance, provide education and outreach. The major caveat is that 40% of the total 319 project fund must be matched with local, non-federal dollars. Watershed specialists are here to help groups apply for funding. The 319 solicitation is typically available on IDEM's website by April 1st. In order to be eligible to apply for funding, applicants must notify the program that they intend to apply in September. These notices of intent are due June 1st. Full applications are due September 1st. Funding from the 319 program can support your development and potential implementation of a watershed management plan. Watershed management plans are the first step in putting management practices on the ground in your watershed. Watershed management plans, or WMPs, are comprehensive documents describing the watershed and the methods to improve it. An approved watershed management plan is required before any 319 funding can be received for building best management practices. The Indiana Watershed Planning Guide is a great resource for people curious about developing a watershed management plan or people already in the process. The EPA also has a guidance document with their 9-element criteria. The first step in writing a watershed management plan is to find or form a watershed group. Watershed groups work best when they have local actors from diverse sectors of the community that use a common interest in water quality to make progress on their goals. Indiana has a watershed management plan checklist to help groups while they are writing their watershed management plan. The checklist helps writers outline causes and sources of pollutants, lay out a plan to reduce pollutants through best management practices, describe the financial and technical assistance that will be required to implement, outreach and education methods, and how to evaluate progress during implementation. IDEM is currently in the process of updating the watershed management plan checklist in order to improve efficiency. There aren't any significant content changes expected to the checklist, but the formatting is going to be updated to improve ease of use. Watershed management plans approved under previous checklists are still valid. Watershed specialists can help local groups with watershed management planning in a variety of ways. Specialists can provide suggestions to put together a steering committee. We can assist with mapping activities like desktop surveys. We can help with load allocations and reductions, and facilitate meetings and provide comments on drafts of the watershed management plan. With an approved watershed management plan, the next step in the cycle is applying for implementation funding. When applying for funding, we encourage watershed groups to also try and obtain outside funding to bolster the IDEM 319 funding. Multiple funding sources improve stability and continuity of the project. Additional state and federal funding programs are available, as well as local and nonprofit funds. Work with your watershed specialist to determine an appropriate funding source for your projects. Some options for outside funding include other state-level programs like Clean Water Indiana or the IDNR's Lake and River Enhancement Grants, other federal programs like the NRCS and Farm Service Agency Farm Conservation Programs. Some non-governmental organizations that sometimes offer money include the Nature Conservancy or local land trusts, and then other federal programs like the State Revolving Fund or local community funding. Watershed specialists can't obtain funding for you, but they can help in many ways, including finding sources of funding, as well as passing along outside funding opportunities. Watershed specialists can also help review grant applications, discuss sustainable funding options, provide examples of success, assist with outreach strategy, and suggest speakers for events. Another great resource is the IDEM funding matrix, which was recently updated by Christy Todd. You can find that at the URL on the screen. The watershed restoration process is completed by monitoring and assessing water quality after a watershed management plan has been implemented. If water quality still does not meet standards, the water body remains on the impaired water list. What we hope, though, is that it does meet standards. What that means is that it is safe for swimming, fishing, and any other designated use. Bringing water quality up to this level is the goal of our programs. When a water is delisted, it can be written up as a success story. Indiana success stories of local watershed management can be found at this EPA website seen at the bottom of your screen. Our hope is that your watershed will also become a success story. To finish, here are the watershed specialists by region and their contact information. And now I am happy to take any questions in the time we have remaining.
Just a reminder for everybody on today's webinar that you can either submit your questions verbally by unmuting yourself, or you can type them into the chat box if you move your mouse cursor over at the bottom of the screen. I actually have a question, Sam. What, and this probably could go to any of the watershed specialists on our call, but just in terms of your interactions with interested parties, you know, groups forming watershed groups or working on their plans, what are some of the key obstacles that you guys encounter from or hear about from those groups?
I would say one of the things would be finding consensus. So when I talked about forming a watershed group, it was you know, bringing diverse parts of the community together and focusing on common goals. So a lot of different parts of the community may have different opinions on how best to achieve water quality or how important it might be to the community. But at the end of the day, when you want to push things forward, you just need to find that common ground and then work on that with everybody. And if Amanda or Christy or Angie wants to jump in with something else.
No, I think that was a really good answer. I think that sometimes a group will form around something they perceive as a problem. And that might relate to another group of stakeholders, in fact, that they need to be on board with their project in order to make their project work well. And so then it's an issue of working together and building consensus and what's important to the entire community so that we all can enjoy the resources that we all have. So some examples of groups that sometimes we find in conflict but eventually work it out might be sometimes lake associations can get crossways with their upstream farming communities. We see that sometimes. Sometimes recreators can get crossways with their upstream whoever's. Recreators with lake communities, if the homeowners, if they feel like the homeowners have access that they don't, or the homeowners association might be putting some pollution in their, I'm not explaining this very well, but you know, that can sometimes become an issue. But you know, with good facilitation and just it working together, they can reach some kind of consensus, and everyone can talk about how they can use the resource for common good and come together for water quality.
Another thing that I guess I've wondered is if like there's somebody, and I think you answered it, but just to be explicit about it, if somebody is sitting out there thinking, well, I have an interest in water quality, you know, I'd like to do something to improve water quality. You know, do they try to find a local stakeholder group? Do you want them to contact you guys? Like, you know, if it's just an interested individual who has a passion for water quality, what would your suggestion to them be?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different avenues that a person can take. Most watershed groups that are active will have some type of presence online. So you could try Googling for, you know, the name of a local river or water body. A lot of times the names of those groups are associated with that. You could also contact your watershed specialist in the region. So they're broken up by kind of quarters of the state. So if you kind of know your general area, you could contact them, and they will have lists or know who is working on different bodies of water in your area. A lot of times you could also contact local officials. So a lot of the people that we work with are at the county or local government level that are sponsoring these grants. So you might be able to contact your county SWCD or something along those lines.
I will add also, we do have a website that is the Watershed Groups Finder, and you could go on there and see if there is a watershed group in your area.
Christy, are you able to type that into the chat box so everyone has access to it? Do you have it handy?
She's way ahead.
I just put it in.
Are there any other questions for our watershed specialists today? I really encourage anybody who has any questions to take advantage of it. These are some really knowledgeable individuals. Okay, going once, going twice. All right, well, I would just like to extend a huge thank you for Sam and Amanda and Christy and Angela, who are on the call today or on the webinar today. I know they put a lot of time into thinking about how best to answer questions and provide information to folks. I also really would like to thank everybody who tuned in to today's webinar. If you go to your chat window, you can see that our IDEM communications division put the link to the Lake Michigan Basin webinar series in there, and Christy also put the Watershed Group Finder in there. So those are great resources I encourage you all to take advantage of. The next webinar series in the series will be talking about our clean marina and clean boating programs, and that'll be at the same time on Wednesday, October 21st. On behalf of everybody at IDEM, thank you very much for tuning in today, and have a great day.